We all do some pretty stupid things when we're young. I remember it was the early 1980s. I found myself on my BMX bike as a young boy, standing on top of the Karratha Lookout Hill, staring down this wide gravel track that sloped all the way down the hill. The guy behind me on his BMX bike was a friend of mine called Aquinas. Aquinas was a very, very large boy, but a good mate. And at the bottom of the hill was two guys, Stanley and Alan, and they'd built a jump for me to go off. The idea was the four of us would take turns going up the hill, coming down the hill, and measuring who can do the furthest jump. Up until this point, I'd only ever ridden on a very narrow, short track with a very small jump at the end, on a flat area. So I wasn't used to this wide path, but looking down this hill, there was a magnificent feeling as I took off first, going down this hill, realizing the speed I was building up was so quick because it was sloping downwards, and there was a sense of being quite safe because the path was really wide. But now I was traveling at a speed I'd never traveled at before. I come towards this jump, which Stanley and Alan are standing either side of, with Stanley holding a stick in his hand, ready to put the marker down for how far I jump. The wind's going through my hair. I hit this jump. I launch upwards, and I find myself now at a height I have never been at before on a bike. I could see the town of Karratha, I could see the ocean. It just felt like I was up somewhere in the clouds. And in that moment of realizing the height I was at, I was filled with both sheer joy and sheer terror at the same time. And it was at that moment I had what you would call an out-of-body experience, but it was more an out-of-bike experience. My body separated from the bike. My body went further ahead, and the bike started to go, it seemed, in the midair sideways. And I went flying ahead on my own towards this gravel road at the bottom, landing on it, hitting it, rolling, having stones and dust and everything fly up. And I could feel myself in the pain building up from this impact. And there I was, after I stopped rolling around, lying in this dust on the road, wondering what type of injuries I've done to my body. And as the dust cleared, I expected to see my two mates, Alan and Stanley, running towards me to see if I'm okay. Not at all. Instead, all I could see coming flying down the hill was my other mate, Aquinas, ready to make the jump, heading in my direction. It was a complete disaster of a day. There was Stanley a few days before convincing me that this narrow path I'd been going on my bike was nowhere near as good as the wide path down the Karratha Lookout, which would lead to joy, but instead it led to complete destruction. If you go to the Gospel of Matthew, there's an account where Jesus is speaking to the crowds, and he tells them about two roads in life. One road is a wide road, and it's a popular road. It's popular because it's wide. It's easy. It's the thing which everyone is doing. But then there's a second road which is not popular. It's narrow. Not many people are on it, and those who are on it have to be aware that this is not the popular road. It would seem to make sense that people in life would choose the wider road. But Jesus says it is the wide road that leads to destruction, and it's the narrow path that leads to life. This is the challenge of modern day culture. Modern day, particularly in Western culture, has this view that life, when it ends, has simply a question mark on it. We don't know what is beyond death, if there is anything at all. And because of that, Western culture says, therefore, be happy with the journey you are on. That is the measurement of a good life, is the happiness someone has during their journey while they're here. And that is great motivation to choose the wide path of life if it makes you happy. But Jesus says it is not the wide path of happiness that determines a good life. A good life is determined entirely by the destination. And if that wide road of happiness leads you to destruction, then you need to get off that path and get onto the one that leads to life. And that is the narrow path. In a culture like mine that is so focused on people being happy, we get dragged into, without knowing, onto these paths of life we think are going to lead us to some form of utopia or some form of meaning, because when we get onto this wide path, for a period of time it feels fantastic and we go, this is great, this is what I need to do. One of the paths that's presented often in movies or in the media or on social media is the path of marriage. Marriage is deemed by society as being one of the great pinnacles of life. People who enter into marriage are greatly blessed, almost fulfilled in many ways in life. And people who don't get access to marriage have somehow missed out on life. So because this romantic focus is so strong on marriage, people will walk into marriage often marrying someone for the wrong reasons because they assume that this person or this institution of marriage is going to lead me to a form of completion and happiness. But what they don't realise is the path of marriage is a narrow path. It's not a wide path. When you go on the wedding day, it appears wide. The wedding is a great ceremony. There's happy smiles. It's all amazing. Everyone can make all the great declarations of love towards each other. But after a while of being married, that wide path shrinks down to a narrow path. And when troubles come and challenges come, the path can become very narrow indeed. And how the two people walk that path is going to determine whether that marriage is going to lead to life or it's going to lead to destruction. Too often when a couple find themselves in the narrow path of marriage, going through some challenge or difficulty, when they start to respond to each other through suspicion or lack of trust or disrespect, or when they start holding grudges or manipulation, or they start putting unrealistic expectations on each other, they have set that narrow path now to change direction. And the direction of that marriage has now gone from going towards life to now towards destruction. Marriage is not a wide path. It is a narrow path. And it is the two people who persist with that narrow path will find their marriage actually leads to life. The book of Ephesians makes an intriguing comparison. It says to be a follower of Jesus is like being in a marriage. Ephesians describes Jesus as being the groom and his followers being the bride. Jesus himself, when he describes being a follower of him, he says it's like walking down a narrow path. Sometimes it's going to be difficult. Sometimes it will be painful. Sometimes it could even be confusing. But Jesus makes two commitments to anyone who chooses to follow him. He says, one, I will walk that path with you the whole way. I will see that path through with you to the very end, and I will never leave you. And then Jesus makes a second promise. When it gets to the end, he will raise that person back to life. This is the painful part of a human marriage, that even if you have a wonderful human marriage, it still ends with the passing of time of one person passing away. I saw a photograph of a widow kneeling by a grave of a husband, and in this photograph she had one hand stretched out towards the grave, as if there was any power within her that could raise her husband back to life, she would use it. But she doesn't have that power. Christ has that power. And Jesus says he will raise up his bride, and he will take that person right through to eternity. Jesus' plan for our life goes well and truly beyond the grave. And that's why the right path in life is not proven by happiness. It's proven by the destination.